Okay, we are live. Hi guys, it's Courtney Burnett here. I'm so excited to have Melissa with me. She's a fellow master IEP coach, and we're going to be talking about AAC communication. Our children are, my child's nonverbal. I don't know if Melissa considers her child nonverbal, but we're going to be talking about their experience accessing communication, getting evaluated for their communication devices, and just some of our struggles along the way and our tips for you. So Melissa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, Courtney. Thank you so much for having me on with you. My name is Melissa Lopez. I have 3 kiddos, and my youngest is 5 years old, and he has a dual diagnosis of both Down syndrome and autism. And I do consider him nonverbal. He does speak occasionally. He has some words that come out, but really he can't hold a real communication with another person. So it's really dependent on having people around him who can understand him and who knows what he wants. A lot of it is reading body language, primarily more than anything. So I do consider him nonverbal because most people cannot understand his wants and his needs, which is one reason why AAC was such an important thing for us to work on getting him so that he could communicate beyond just being able to request something, because that's not real communication. I wanted him to be able to communicate with everyone, with his peers, with his teachers, with his siblings, and be able to kind of engage the way that other kids engage with family members and with their peers.
Right. And for us, we started, so my daughter is 16. I almost said 15 because I'm kind of in denial that she turned 16, but so she's 16. And our journey we started with traditional speech. Hannah was not mimicking, babbling, doing word approximations. So we were in traditional speech. Then we started adding in American Sign Language, but we had to adapt a lot of the signs. So a lot of people don't know sign language. And then on top of it, once you start adapting the signs, that they don't really know what those adaptations are. So we're running into roadblocks there. The other roadblock was a lot of signs require small motor skills, and Hannah really didn't have the small motor skills to do the signs. So my daughter started her journey with like this big box, and it had a paper overlay, and you could record up to 8 sheets, and then you would have to take out the sheet, re-record the messages. It was very cumbersome. So even though it was a start to using a communication device, the technology wasn't there at that time. And so it didn't get used very well because it was so much work to re-record every single page every time you laid it down, and to remember this page is page number 1 and this page was page number 2 with that. So our journey was very much just kind of pushing to use it. So I wanted to let you talk about when you started looking at alternative communication, or when you found out about it, what kind of drew you to it, and just a little bit about your story with that.
Okay, so my son he's 5 years old now, and our journey is kind of very similar to yours. We tried sign language with him when he was much younger. He's been receiving speech therapy services pretty much since well before 1 year old. So we've been doing this for quite a long time. And sign language was just something that he struggled with for the same reasons that you said. He didn't have the fine motor skills in his fingers to be able to do the signs. And so what happened with us is he would learn about 5 signs and use them really consistently. And then we'd start trying to add on more signs. And he would lose the signs that he already knew very, very well. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, because he would only use 5 signs consistently no matter what. But I knew he knew more than that, but he wouldn't show us that. And so we were really struggling with sign language being a form of communication. Then when he turned 3, he aged out of early intervention, and we started preschool at a really amazing school that we have here in Rio Rancho, New Mexico. And they are really, really good about working with kiddos who have special needs. And so we started there, and his language he was really, really far behind. It wasn't just language. He was far behind in all of his gross motor skills as well. So at 3 years old, he still couldn't crawl on all 4s. He could not walk. He could not talk. So there was a lot of other issues going on at the time too. So I wasn't sure if he was working so hard trying to learn some of those bigger skills, like learning how to crawl and learning how to, explore his environment and all of that, putting all that work into that, everybody kept saying, oh, well, if he's working so hard to do this, there's a good, that his speech is probably going to be put on the back burner and it'll come. But we kept not getting anywhere with sign language. And school was, he was making some progress with school, but we weren't having a lot of word approximations, sounds. He wouldn't mimic, he wouldn't copy, he wouldn't do any of those things. And I was really worried about his needs being met and having to let this little guy go to school when he couldn't really communicate. So I really had to trust his team. And what happened for us is in his second year of preschool, they started using the Big Mac button with him. And at this time, too, we only had a Down syndrome diagnosis, so we didn't know about the autism diagnosis yet. And I think that's really important because had we known that earlier, I think some of these struggles that we had wouldn't have taken so long to recognize. Because with the Big Mac button, he wouldn't respond to it either. He would kind of, but he'd play. They were like, well, he's not doing it meaningfully. He's just playing with it. So we don't think that that's going to work for him. And I struggled with it because I don't really think that helped him communicate with anybody. And it was really hard. So what I was seeing at home was that he was communicating with body language. If he wanted something, he'd kind of go to that area. It took a lot of me just kind of knowing him really well. And then pictures, real life pictures or real life objects. If he wanted his water, he would get his water cup and give it to you if he wanted more. So there was a lot of nonverbal communication. And I shared that with his team. So they started doing like a modified picture exchange communication system. So for those of you that don't know what that is, it's where the child has a picture. In our instance, it was a real life picture, and they use that to communicate with another partner. And what was happening with him is he would not get the card and hand it directly to whomever he was communicating with. So in this instance, his speech therapist or his teacher. Instead, he would slide it across the table. And then they were saying that it wasn't meaningful communication. So we had a lot of
so he was communicating, but they were kind of hung up on the hand it to me versus slide it to me. And if he's sliding it, he's not communicating. And
right. And so they were saying he needed to communicate with that person. Like it needed to be clear that it was that person he was asking. Like, for instance, at snack time, he would select the picture of goldfish. Goldfish was like one of his favorite snacks at the time. He'd slide it across the table, but they wouldn't give him the goldfish because he didn't hand it to the actual physical person.
Yeah, that's frustrating. Like as a speech therapist assistant, because if you honor that and you get excited and you give him the goldfish, he's going to start handing it or getting more excited, realizing, wow, when I get this card out, I get something. And that's one of the ways we really reinforce that this is communication. When they hand you a picture of a water bottle, they get water. That's where they're starting to connect that this picture actually holds meaning.
Right.
So that had to be frustrating as a mom.
That wasn't happening for him, and he was getting frustrated, and I was getting frustrated. And a short time after that was when we got the autism diagnosis. And so I think when I go back and I look at that experience that he had, that's a really hard thing for somebody with autism to do, is to make like that. Like they wanted the eye contact, they wanted him handing a card to a person, and we didn't understand why he wasn't doing it, but he was communicating. And so we did have to kind of hash that out a little bit about, you do need to give him that, he's sliding it across the table, that needs to be accepted. And then we work on teaching him how to put the card in your hand. But it was something that they wanted and that they insisted that he had to be able to do successfully before we could move on to using an actual AAC device. So at that point in time, I actually requested that he be evaluated for an evaluation, and we got what was known as an observation. So they did an observation. They had a speech therapist there, his speech therapist there, and then we have an assistive technology specialist that came in and kind of just observed him in his environment, observed him with the pictures, observed how he communicated. And they actually did kind of have an iPad there with him just to kind of see what he did. And one of the things that they told me was that he didn't have finger isolation. So he could not isolate his index finger to be able to make selections on the iPad correctly and meaningfully and accurately. And so they didn't feel that he was ready for that. And they really wanted to focus on using that modified picture exchange communication system better before they considered him to be a candidate for AAC. And that's kind of how we left it at the end of his second year of preschool. And the funny thing is that right after that, we went on summer break. We were home for a week, and we had this major injury happen at home. So I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. My older son walked into the bathroom to ask me a question. His little brother was right behind him, and he fell and he tripped and he broke his leg. We didn't realize it at the exact time that he'd broken his leg. I knew he was hurt because he was crying, but he didn't cry like a child who broke his leg. But the bad thing was there was no way for me to communicate with him. I could sign to him and ask him, where are you hurt? He didn't understand. He couldn't tell me what was going on. And so it was really high stress levels because I didn't know what was happening. I ended up taking him in to be evaluated by his pediatrician, and he has a really high pain threshold, which we didn't realize until that moment, because he wasn't crying unless you moved him. Otherwise, he was sitting there and he looked
like, I'm good.
He looked normal. His leg looked okay. It was a little swollen, but it didn't look obviously broken. And so it was really hard to kind of determine what was going on. And initially, his pediatrician actually even thought that he looked okay. But we sent him for x-rays, and it turned out that it was a pretty bad break. He ended up breaking his tibia. It was a spiral fracture all the way through, clear through the bone. I mean, he should have been, if it would have been me, I would have been wailing and not able to talk. And he looked pretty good considering that injury. And what actually pushed me to get AAC and to be more forceful about it was that whole experience that happened afterwards. So after we found out his leg was broken, we had to go to the emergency room. We had to get him evaluated to see if he needed surgery because we knew it was a pretty big break. And the ER staff was really pushy with him answering questions about what happened. And I kept explaining to them that he had a dual diagnosis, he had Down syndrome, he had autism, he could not communicate. He can't answer your questions, he can't tell. And I kept telling him, this is what happened, I'm telling you what happened. And they wanted him to be able to answer the question of what happened over and over and over and over again. And at that point in time as a mom, I felt super defeated because my child had a pretty good injury. I was super stressed out about it, and I felt like I wasn't being heard. I kept saying he has 2 diagnoses, he can't talk, and it was like they didn't even hear me. They wanted to hear it from him. And part of me gets that. I do get that, but they weren't acknowledging the difficulties that he had as far as communication was. And it was a really long day. At the end of the day, it ended up being that the staff actually said that since he could not respond to their questions, that they actually wanted to investigate the fall because he couldn't tell them what happened. And that literally crushed me. I think I came home and cried for probably 3 days straight while we tried to figure out what was going on with his leg and whether he was going to need surgery and how I was going to get him kind of back to where he was before the fall. And at that point in time, I was like, I need to teach him. I need to find some platform, whatever it may be, to be able to get him to communicate. Pictures are not going to do it for us. Right. I knew that was kind of the secret. I knew that's how we were going to get him to learn. But just doing these exchanges and just being able to request things, that's just not communication. I know I needed to kind of find a way around that. And luckily, we were doing speech therapy during this, it was during the summer. So private speech therapy, and his speech therapist was fabulous. And she believed that he could do it. So she said, you know what, let's start trialing devices. And that's kind of where we started.
So there's so much to unpack there, because it's crazy to have the experience at the hospital where you felt interrogated. And although they were looking out for your son, they also were kind of using because he couldn't communicate, meaning that, suggesting something bad happened is very hurtful. And then I know how you feel as a mom, you already feel bad that he got hurt.
Right.
And then being turned down at the school for AAC because of some AAC myths. And so those myths are that, there has to be finger isolation. That's a really big myth. And if you're experiencing that, or you've had that happen in your school experience with your child, that's where AT comes in, and they can assess and see if the child needs a stylist or positioning or eye gaze. There's so many things that we can do as a team with OT and PT and the speech therapist, that we shouldn't be turning kids away from trialing AAC because they can't isolate their finger. I experienced that with my daughter as well. And how I figured out she could isolate her finger was through a different game, and she had to have her finger on the fish to make it go. And she totally isolated. I'm like, okay, you've been playing us. You can isolate your finger. But that's a really big AAC myth. And then the second one I heard in your story was that they had to prove that these different mile markers in order to be allowed on the playing field.
Yes.
And that's another big AAC myth, and one that we should be presuming competency, that they can learn it, just like we presume competency when we're talking, and we presume that our child's going to sound imitate, word imitate, and then start producing words. And so that's the same thing that we can do with alternative communication, is by allowing it to be in his environment and have him explore with it, have different caregivers model it for him, that he can then begin to learn it by having it available versus having to prove that he should be allowed to have it in his environment.
Right. So what we ended up doing, and I didn't know this existed at the time, but we trialed several different devices. One of them was very similar to the one you used with your daughter. You could record it. You had to slide in different sheets of paper. And you are absolutely right. That was totally cumbersome. And so when I was working with his speech therapist, his private speech therapist, I said, you know what? I need something that's easy. Like, if I have to do all this work, not only will I not do it, but it'll be hard for a team even at school to do it. So I'm looking at it from the perspective of everybody. Like, it needs to be easy enough for all of us to be able to use it with him all the time, or it's not going to get used. So I absolutely agree. So we did try that. We brought it home. It didn't work well. And then we tried two different types of software for AAC. I think the first one was Touch Chat that we trialed, and then we trialed Proloquo to Go. But what I realized was that there are actual key guards that can be made for the iPad that will help with finger isolation. So even though he couldn't, so his issue was that he would slide his finger all the way across the screen. So you knew where he was going, but he was hitting kind of all the buttons along the way, if that made sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
We had to help him.
Yeah, trialing is important for those different reasons. And then there's, you can put a timer delay. So they have to touch a button for just slightly longer in order for the button to recognize that was a hit, to help with some of the accidental hits. Yes. And then another thing you can do is have the square actually light up red, and then it goes. So they know they're pressing on it because it's red. So each system's a little bit different. Which one did you end up going with?
We ended up going with Proloquo to Go, and he actually ended up not needing the key guard very long. We used it for about a month, I want to say. And by then, you're right. So once we decided to use Proloquo to Go, I kind of got really comfortable with it and went in there and played around. And there's a lot of different button selections that you can select for your child to help him out. And since he was doing this like sliding finger thing, there's a setting in there that the button isn't selected until your finger is released from the iPad. So if he slid from the bottom all the way to the top and that's where he stopped, that's the only button that's activated instead of activating all of them along the way. And so we really had to kind of play around with the time delay. Am I going to he had this, in the beginning, it was a lot of playing with it. So he liked the sound of just hitting the button, and he over and over and over and over and over and over and over, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I wanted him to kind of get a little bit better with using it, not just playing with it. So you can set a delay also so that they can't just repeatedly hit a button. There's like, I think we have like a 3-second delay. So he's got to wait at least 3 seconds before he can push it again. So that way he's not just playing with it. But that's what we ended up doing. We started I think we started trialing devices like in April, very soon after his injury. And then by the end of the summer, he was using Proloquo very well. Luckily for us in New Mexico, we have a division that lends parents iPads, and my speech therapist was very knowledgeable in that. So we were able to borrow different iPads with different communication devices. And the only reason and the only way I was actually able to get it for my son is I actually applied for a grant that actually paid for the Proloquo app to be put on our iPad. And I thought it was really important because he was doing so well with it. And what I've learned with my son is that when I see those gains that he's going, if I don't pounce on it, we end up losing it. And so he was doing so well. He was starting to, you could use real live pictures in there. That was the other thing. The real live pictures were really important for him. What they had tried doing at school was using abstract pictures.
Yes.
So just a communication board with really abstract pictures that are really not meaningful for a 3 or 4-year-old who's still learning language. There was no connection between the picture and the word. And it was really hard for him to communicate with an abstract picture. However, if we were using a picture of his water bottle or something that was very familiar to him, it went really well. So I liked that Proloquo allowed you to use real pictures. So that was about a year ago. And now I would say that he's able to do both. He can use real pictures and he can use some of those more abstract pictures, but it takes a lot of repetition and it takes a lot of learning for him. But that's kind of how we started. He started using it over the summer. School started back up in August. And I was calling up his special education group leader. And, the first thing I asked was for a new IEP meeting. So, for those of you parents out there that don't know, you can ask for an IEP meeting at any time. I felt it was super important because he was using this device with all of his outside therapy providers, which I think were about 5 at the time. He was using it at his grandma's house. He was using it everywhere but at school. And so I called him up and said, we need a new evaluation. Can you please reevaluate him? And when they did that, they agreed to do that. And 30 days later, we had it incorporated into his IEP.
So I have a couple of questions about that. Did they purchase one for at school, or did they just agree to use the one that you were providing from home and that they would incorporate it into his goals at school?
No, they did actually purchase him one for school.
That's great. That's great.
That they told me that they don't like using home devices at school. So he has a device that at school that's coming home with him all the time. So that's the other thing. So for those of you parents out there whose children do use AAC devices, they should be bringing it home over break. So whether that's Christmas break or summer break or in the evenings, that's not something that your school should be holding on to. That should be something that's sent home with your child. So he has that right now, especially for, I think that's important for this long break that we're having too right now, where school's not in session in a physical building. I'm hoping that anybody who's using AAC device has access to that while we're in this transition.
And then I think the other thing that I heard that I know because we're coaches, but some families might not know, is you kind of took the data that you took the data from the summer, from working with this outside therapist to using a certain kind of communication app, brought it to the school, requested a meeting, and had a team meeting. So they had these roadblocks that they said he has to do these different things before he qualifies, which we know are myths, but they had those there. So one way you worked around that was to have outside therapy, private therapy help you with trialing, looking at the different things available in your community, then bringing that data back to the school. And at that point, they couldn't really deny that he was making progress, that the things they thought were going to be roadblocks were actually not roadblocks for him once he got in there and started exploring with the device.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. So had I waited, I don't think we would be using an AAC device as quickly. I think one of the other myths, since we're talking about myths, is a lot of times people think that younger children can't use high-tech AAC devices. And that's absolutely not true. He is so fabulous with using it. He's actually so good with it right now that he can move through different screens and different menus. He can pick all kinds of stuff that I didn't even realize he could do, but he can learn it and he can pick it up. And so I just want to share that with anybody out there who has maybe a younger child in a school saying, well, you know, it's really typically high-tech devices really used more for older children because they can use it better, they can understand it better. That is absolutely not true. So he started using this at 4 years old. And now at 5 years old, he is doing amazing. He is learning it so well and taking it with him everywhere. And he can answer my questions. We're still learning. Like I kind of joke a little bit about that whole experience that happened last year. As terrifying as it was, I don't know that he could answer all those questions today, but he can answer questions about himself and use a lot more communication than where we were a year ago. And we would not be there without his AAC device. The other thing that I've seen happen is he's actually starting to use words. So I do say that he's nonverbal because most people cannot understand him. And he's got a very small, list of words that he can actually speak. But that AAC device has taught him words. Him pushing the buttons, hearing the sound. Because he has autism, I really believe that he needs to hear words repeated and said exactly the same way every time. So I don't think you learn speech by listening to human interaction, if that makes any sense. So it's been a huge blessing for us to have that. And I just see his speech exploding. And I know there are people that believe that if they start trying, even teaching like a younger child sign language or using an AAC device, that their kids aren't going to be able to talk. And that's so absolutely not true. I see him just making tremendous progress every day, and I'm so happy for it.
Yeah, and you really touched on something I've seen with my own clients, and it doesn't happen for everybody. My daughter still doesn't do word approximations, and I think for her, because of her cerebellum being so much smaller and the motor planning, I'm not sure if that will come for her, but for a lot of my clients, they see, especially my clients who have autism, see the same thing. They start using the device, they're hearing it, they're doing the motor planning with it, and they're getting that model for them over and over again. And then they start exploring more with verbal language. So that's just, we touched on like 3 of my 5 top myths right here in this broadcast. We talked about they're too young. They're never too young to start exploring with AAC, and we don't wait to teach our kids to talk. We start modeling from birth when we're talking to them. We're telling them what we're doing. We're exploring with songs and babbling. You can do all those things with a device and be that same verbal model for them using the device and helping them find a new pathway. So I'm so thankful you came on. There's so many things that we could take away from this. One is don't give up. In her mom gut, she knew that her son could do this, so she pursued the other avenues. You can reach out to a master IEP coach to help you navigate the school system. And I think one thing that's really important to know is I don't think that school staff maliciously do some of these things. I think there's a lot of things that I know when I attended school, we barely touched on AAC. There's not a whole class on it. So a lot of staff just don't know about it. So if they've heard about it or their mentor taught them this way, they just kind of think that this is the process to getting it. And having a new way of thinking, a new way of doing things is sometimes hard. So I think that the school staff didn't intentionally try to block him from communicating. They just felt like this is the usual way we do it. And so they just kind of followed the roadmap that they had been shown And Melissa's like, I'm going to shake it up and show a new roadmap to getting there. So I just think that I feel like I'm constantly advocating and kind of fighting for different things. And I have to remind myself that people don't know what they don't know. And sometimes it takes seeking outside help that can help you communicate to your team that there's a new way to do it and there's a different way to do it.
I think that's a great point, because his team is actually we've had a fabulous team kind of following him this whole time, and they are a really fabulous school. But I want to remind parents that you're a member of that team. So if something's not working, not because somebody's doing something wrong, just because it's not working, they were trying the best to get him help as far as communicating. We didn't know about that other diagnosis. So that was something else that was kind of playing in the background. Had we known that, maybe that would have changed kind of, the path that they were going down. I don't know. But I don't believe that any of it was malicious in any way. But if you as a parent have that gut feeling that something's not working and that maybe something else will work better, voice that opinion. If you need help from somebody professionally, like a master IEP coach or anybody else who can be there to support you, make sure that you reach out and do that, because you expressing those concerns as a member of the IEP team will help you get your child's needs met. So I absolutely agree with that, Courtney.
Yeah. And so if you go to my, it's actually not my, but it's AACchecklist.com. You can actually download a free AAC checklist that has tips for you to talk with your team. And I know, Melissa, I think you have a freebie for an IEP checklist over on your website as well. And so I'll have Melissa type in her stuff below in the comments and share it over to her page as well. So you can go to AACchecklist.com. Melissa's, it's your name, right? MelissaLopez.com.
MelissaAngeloLopez.com.
Your middle name.
Yeah.
So that's good. Well, thank you for joining us, guys. If you have additional questions on how to help your child get AAC as part of their IEP, get it incorporated into your goals, you have 2 great resources here. And thank you for sharing your story. And some of the things you shared are a common thing I hear from a lot of parents is the not knowing how their child's feeling, the desperate trying to interpret, and then something like that happens with a serious injury, and you're really left with guessing. And luckily, you've kind of followed your gut with I just would like him to be x-rayed, because I find with my daughter too, there's just the pain tolerance or the expression of how we would express something really terrible is not how they do it. And so just following your mom gut, I saw that, and not giving up on following through at the hospital, following your mom gut, that there had to be another way for him to communicate, and partnering with your private speech therapist on that, and to just seeking out even becoming a master IEP coach, just to have the knowledge of the school system to not only help your son, but your community. So
yes,
really appreciate you sharing your story.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for having me.
All right.